Hello students, you know that Indian society is always characterized by diversity. On top of that, there are various structural inequalities as a result of which major segments of the population face the problem of social exclusion, and that brings the necessity of reservation. The historical background of reservation takes us to William Hunter and Jyotirao Phule in 1882, who originally conceived the idea of caste-based reservation. The reservation system that exists in India today was introduced in 1933 when British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald presented the Communal Award. The award made provision for separate electorates for Muslims, Sikhs, Indian Christians, Anglo-Indians, Europeans and the Dalits. After long negotiations, Gandhi and Ambedkar signed the Pune Pact, where it was decided that there would be a single Hindu electorate with certain reservations in it. After independence, initially reservations were provided only for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. In the exercise of the powers conferred by Article 340 of the Constitution, the President appointed a backward class commission in December 1978 under the chairmanship of B.P. Mondal. The commission was formed to determine the criteria for defining India's socially and educationally backward classes and to recommend steps to be taken for the advancement of those classes. The Mondal Commission concluded that India's population consisted of approximately 52% OBCs, therefore 27% government jobs should be reserved for them. The Commission has developed 11 indicators of social, educational and economic backwardness. Apart from identifying backward classes among Hindus, the Commission has also identified backward classes among non-Hindus like the Muslims, the Sikhs, the Christians and the Buddhists. It has generated an All India Other Backward Classes list of 3743 castes and a more underprivileged depressed backward classes list of 2108 castes. The Supreme Court's intervention in the matter is important. In the Indra Soni case of 1992, the Supreme Court, while upholding the 27% quota for backward classes, struck down the government notification reserving 10% government jobs for economically backward classes among the higher castes. The Supreme Court in the same case also upheld the principle that the combined reservation beneficiaries should not exceed 50% of India's population. The concept of creamy layer also gained currency through this judgment and provision that reservation for backward classes should be confined to initial appointments only and not extend to promotions. Recently, the Constitutional Act of 2019 has provided 10% reservation in government jobs and educational institutions for the economically backward classes in the reserved category. The Act amends Articles 15 and 16 of the Constitution by adding clauses empowering the government to provide reservation on the basis of economic backwardness. So what is the present context of reservation? Indian society, as I mentioned, is characterized by diversity. On top of that, there are structural inequalities based along the lines of caste and ethnicity. Although every caste except those at the top of the caste hierarchy, suffers from unequal and hierarchical assignment of rights, it is the untouchable castes which have suffered the most, and they are referred to as the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. Historically, they were denied the right to property, business, education and all civil, cultural and religious rights except manual labor and service to castes above them. Untouchables also suffer from residential segregation and social isolation. Another source of exclusion is linked with ethnic identity, from which groups like the Adivasis, referred to officially as the scheduled tribes, suffer. This group has suffered from isolation, exclusion, neglect and underdevelopment due to their geographical and cultural isolation. In their case, exclusion can take several forms, including the denial of right to resources around which they live and displacement induced by economic development. In 2001, the scheduled castes accounted for around 17% of the Indian population, while the scheduled tribes accounted for around 8%. Or together, about 1/5 of India's population, about 250 million people. In general, both scheduled castes and scheduled tribes have lower ownership of capital assets, are more likely to depend on casual wage labor, they are less educated, and suffer from high degrees of poverty and child mortality. So what has been the approach of the Indian government towards these segments of the population? The approach has been shaped by two key provisions in the country's constitution adopted in 1950. These are the twin principles of non-discrimination and equal opportunity, and the empowerment of the state to take steps to ensure non-discrimination and equal opportunity in practice. The approach has involved three elements: legal and other safeguards against discrimination, proactive measures in the state and state-supported sector in the form of reservation policy, which we are going to talk about extensively, and informal affirmative action in agriculture and private industry as part of general development and empowerment measures. So what is the rationale behind reservation? The age-old caste system of India is responsible for the origination of the reservation system in the country. In simple terms, it is about facilitating access to seats in the government jobs, educational institutions, and even legislatures to certain sections of the population. These sections have faced historical injustice due to their caste identity. As a quota-based affirmative action, the reservation can also be seen as positive discrimination. In India, it is governed by government policies backed by the Indian Constitution. India's current affirmation action policy, otherwise known as the reservation policy, is operative in three main spheres, namely appointment and promotion in government services, admissions to public educational institutions, and seats in central, state, and local legislatures. So what are the constitutional provisions which govern reservation in India? Part 16 deals with reservation of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in central and state legislatures. Articles 15 Clause 4 and 16 Clause 4 of the Constitution enable the state and central governments to reserve seats in government services for the members of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. The Constitution was amended by the Constitution Amendment Act of 1995, and a new clause was inserted in Article 16 to enable the government to provide reservation in promotion. Later, Clause 4A was modified by the Constitution by the 85th Amendment Act to provide consequential seniority to scheduled caste and scheduled tribe candidates promoted by giving reservation. The Constitutional 81st Amendment Act of 2000 inserted Article 16 Clause 4B, which enables the state to fill the unfilled vacancies of a year which are reserved for scheduled caste, scheduled tribes in the succeeding year, thereby nullifying the ceiling of 50% reservation on total number of vacancies of that year. There is also reservation of seats in Parliament and state legislative assemblies. Articles 330 and 332 provide for specific representation through reservation of seats for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the Parliament and in the state legislative assemblies respectively. Article 243 Clause D provides reservation of seats for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in every panchayat. Article 233 provides reservation of seats for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in every municipality, while Article 335 says that the claims of scheduled tribes and scheduled castes shall be taken into consideration constituently with the maintenance of efficacy of the administration. Reservation in government services deserves particular attention. The most important aspect, in fact, of the reservation policy is that relating to government services, Article 16, Clause 4 of the Constitution empowers the state to make any provision for the reservation in appointments or posts in favour of backward classes of citizens, and provision for reservation in matters of promotion to any class or classes of posts in the services under the state in favour of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. In pursuing this provision, the government made reservation for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in proportion to their share of the population. There are also reservations in the promotion of employed persons. The government service included are the government civil service, public sector undertakings, statutory and semi-government bodies and voluntary agencies which are under the control of the government or receiving grant in aid. At the central level, some services are however excluded from the reservation policy, and these include most prominently the defence and the judiciary. Reservation in education is also important to consider. Article 15, Clause 4 of the Constitution empowers the state to make special provisions for the educational advancement of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. In pursuing this provision, the state reserves places for scheduled castes and scheduled tribe students in educational institutions, including all colleges run by the central or the state governments and all government-aided educational institutions. This is supported by a number of financial schemes, including scholarships, special hostels for scheduled castes and scheduled tribe students, concessions in matters of fees, grants for books, and educational coaching. The third most important sphere of the reservation policy relates to representation in central and state legislatures. Under Articles 330, 332 and 334 of the Constitution, seats are reserved for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the central legislatures and state legislatures. Similar reservations are provided in local level bodies at district, taluk and village levels. The reservation of seats is complemented by statutory provisions to enhance political participation by scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Smaller election deposits are required from members of these groups, for example. Why is reservation important and why is it necessary in India even after so many years of independence? First, to correct the historical injustice faced by backward castes in the country. Second, to provide a level playing field for backward sections as they cannot compete with those who have had access to resources for centuries. Third, to ensure adequate representation of backward classes in the services under the state. Fourth, for the advancement of the backward classes, I think that is implicit in the nomenclature of backward classes. And fifth, to ensure equality as a basis of meritocracy, and that is, all people must be brought to the same level before judging them on the basis of merit. So, reservation is important because it improves human development. Over time, there has been a considerable increase in the share of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in government employment and educational institutions. Reservations in the legislature have also provided a space for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in the executive and in the decision-making process. The formal reservation policy in the governmental sector and the general developmental empowerment measures in the private sector have also contributed to an improvement in the human development of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. But there are problems in the reservation policy which need to be addressed. First, the success of the policy has been uneven across sectors and departments. Second, the policy is limited to the government sector, while more than 90% of scheduled castes and scheduled tribe workers are employed in the private sector. Finally, despite the improvement in human development among scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, disparities in attainment with non-scheduled castes and non-scheduled tribes persist even to this day. This indicates that addressing social exclusion is often a far more difficult challenge than addressing challenges like poverty in India. So what are the reasons for frustration? Reservation in state services led to divisions and enmity among government employees, vitiating the atmosphere at the workplace. Caste-based reservation only perpetuates the notion of caste in society rather than eradicating it. These are some of the apprehensions and misgivings that many people have about the reservation policy in India. They also believe that reservations was introduced to ensure that historically underprivileged communities were given equal access to resources. But irrespective of the economic progress, they continue to remain socially disadvantaged. Reservation destroys self-respect, so much so that competition is no longer necessary to determine the best. Reservations are the biggest enemy of meritocracy, which is the foundation of any progressive country. It has become a tool to meet narrow political ends through invoking class loyalties and primordial loyalties. The dominant and elite class within the backward caste has appropriated the benefits of reservation, and the most marginalized within the backward caste have remained marginalized. In other words, the benefits of reservation don't seem to have accrued to those for whom it was really intended. Reservation has therefore become the mechanism of exclusion rather than inclusion, as many upper caste poors are also facing discrimination and injustice, which breeds frustration in society. Reservation is increasingly seen as a remedy for the adverse effects of ill-thought-out developmental policies. In developed states like Haryana, Gujarat and Maharashtra, in spite of their economies being relatively better compared to some of the other states in India, three things have been worrying the people: acute agrarian distress, stagnation in employment growth, and distortions in the developmental trajectory. In this backdrop, for governments, it is easier to talk of reservation than to make a course correction. Increasing reservation demands among upper castes are also arising from the fear of losing privilege and the inability to cope with change. Upper castes have therefore begun to feel disadvantaged, especially in the context of government jobs, as they don't get similar advantages like backward classes. And that is why the upper castes seem to be complaining that reservation is basically amounting to reverse discrimination. So there are important suggestions which have been put forward regarding reservation. The reservation benefits should flow to the vast majority of underprivileged children from deprived castes, not to a few privileged children with a caste tag. Families of officials belonging to high ranks, high-income professionals and others above a certain income should not get the reservation benefits, especially in government jobs. The process of reservation should filter the truly economically deprived individuals and bring justice to them. Revolutionary changes in the education system at the grassroots level seems to be the need of the hour. There is also need for awareness generation, because while the unreserved segments keep on opposing the provision, the neediest sections from within the reserved segments are hardly aware about how to avail benefits from the provisions, or even whether there are such provisions in existence. However, reservation policy has had its positive outcomes in India, and there is no denying that. There has been a striking increase in the number of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe government employees. The absolute number of scheduled caste employees increased from 218,000 in 1950 to 641,000 in 1991. The number of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe employees also increased significantly in public sector undertakings, nationalized banks, and public insurance companies. We also notice positive outcomes in the realm of education. The evidence indicates that there has been a large increase in enrollment of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in educational institutions. In 1981, the proportion of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes among total graduates were estimated to be 3.3% and 0.8% respectively, far below their shares in total population. By the late 1990s, however, these figures had risen to 7.8% and 2.7% respectively. So therefore, the positive impact of reservation can be felt even in matters of political representation and human development. As described in the previous sections, seats are reserved for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in central and state legislatures in proportion to their shares in the population, and these are mandatory in nature. Thus, in 2004, 75 of the 543 seats in the Lok Sabha were reserved for the scheduled castes and 41 were reserved for scheduled tribes. Of the total number of seats in the Vidhan Sabha, more than 2,000 seats were reserved for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and that is an impressive achievement. There has been in recent years clear improvement also in human development indicators among scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Between 1983-84 and 1999-2000, for example, monthly per capita consumption expenditure and literacy rates among scheduled castes and scheduled tribes both increased, while the incidence of poverty unmistakably fell. Therefore, one needs to think through some of the implementation issues when it comes to the reservation policy in India. Currently, the reservation policy applies to government and government-supported sectors only and excludes the private sector. However, it is estimated that more than 90% of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe workers are employed in the private sector, and there is danger that such workers lack protection against discrimination, which is what the reservation policy has been trying to address from the very beginning. Similarly, all private educational institutions are also excluded from the reservation policy. Another issue relates to the quality of representation afforded by the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribe representatives in the legislatures. Studies have indicated that they experience lower participation, less articulation, less assertion, and less independence than representatives from high castes. So reservation seems to be touching only the surface of the problem. It has to go deeper. It has been argued that scheduled castes and scheduled tribe representatives from reserved constituencies are limited in their ability to represent their group interests because the constituencies are still made up overwhelmingly of non-members of their groups. There is also the question of the access to justice when it comes to these marginalized sections. An issue relates to the access of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes to the institutions of justice in seeking protection against discrimination. Studies indicate that scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are generally faced with unsurmountable obstacles in their efforts to seek justice in the event of discrimination. Do they have remedies? The official statistics and primary survey data bring out this character of justice institutions. The data on civil rights cases, for example, shows that only 1.6% of the total cases registered in 1991 were convicted, and that this has fallen to 0.9% in 2000. A study in Andhra Pradesh of the reasons for low conviction observed negligence and collusion at the stage of registration, charge sheeting and investigation, in seeking justice before the law in the court, and also in giving compensation. There is also the important question of time limits. Reservations in political representation are accompanied by a time limit. They were initially provided for a 10-year period with a provision for extension every 10 years. By contrast, in the areas of government services and education, it is left to the government to use reservations up to the point where it is considered that discrimination against scheduled castes and scheduled tribes is no longer a major problem. There is, however, a minority view which expresses concern about the extension of reservation policies without a time limit. Nevertheless, the majority view is in favor of extension as long as discrimination and social exclusion of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes persists, and there is a general support in government for reservation policies without explicit time limits. So what is the way forward? Reservation seems it is fair as far as it provides appropriate positive discrimination for the benefit of the downtrodden and the economically backward sections of the society. But when it tends to harm the society and ensure privileges to some at the cost of others for narrow political ends, it should be done away with as soon as possible. In other words, the whole purpose of reservation should not turn into a dysfunction. The communities excluded from reservations harbor animosity and prejudice against the castes included in the reservation category, and that is not a desirable situation. So, we conclude that when more people aspire for backwardness rather than for forwardness, the country reaches a state of stagnation. It seems that reservation should not be allowed to work at cross purposes. Meritocracy should not be polluted by injecting relaxation of entry barriers. Rather, what should be encouraged is offering financial aid to the underprivileged. A strong political will is indispensable to find equilibrium between justice to the backwards, equity for the forwards, and efficiency for the entire system. Of course, as long as major segments of the population live in deprivation and misery without access to adequate resources and job opportunities, the logic of reservation cannot be questioned. But reservation should be directed where it is required, and that would require prudent political action and vigilance on part of the government through and through. Thank you.